She traded her last good horse for $40 and a broken loom that nobody else in Dunvegan Crossing would touch. The horse had been her father's. A gray quarter horse named for a river she couldn't remember the name of anymore, and she had led it to Angus Flett's yard on a Tuesday morning, while the mud was still frozen hard enough to crack under her boots, and she had come home with the money and the loom loaded in a borrowed cart, and she had not looked back at the horse because looking back would not have helped anything. Her name was Cora Beaumont. She was 28 years old, widowed 11 months, and she had exactly $40, a quarter section of land that owed her everything she'd put into it, and now a loom that 3 different people in Dunvegan Crossing had told her was beyond salvaging. The man who loaded the cart for her, Angus Flett's hired hand, a taciturn boy who kept his opinion mostly to himself, said only one thing before she drove away. "That thing hasn't run since Mrs. Okafor had it, and Mrs. Okafor gave up on it 2 years back." "I know," Cora said. "Just saying. I heard you." She drove home along the rutted track that followed the creek north, with the loom rattling behind her, and the April sky the particular gray that meant more cold coming, and she thought about what she was doing and whether it made sense. She decided it probably didn't make sense in the way that most people use the word sense. But she had looked at that loom in Flett's back shed for 20 minutes before she made the offer, and what she had seen was not a broken machine. What she had seen was a machine that had been given up on before anyone had fully understood what was wrong with it. That was a different thing. That was the kind of problem she knew how to approach. Her husband, Thomas, would have asked what her plan was. He would have said it without accusation, in the particular steady way he had of accepting the shape of a situation before arguing with it. She had been married to Thomas Beaumont for 4 years, and she had never once heard him ask why she'd done something. Only ever what she was going to do next. He had been dead 11 months, and she still heard his voice in the silence after she made decisions. She brought the loom into the main room of the house, which was the warmest room and the one with the best light from the south-facing window, and she set it against the wall and looked at it for a long time without touching it. The frame was intact, which had been the first thing she'd checked in Flett's shed. Maple, old growth, the kind of wood that didn't come apart easily regardless of what happened around it. The beater was cracked along the top rail but not broken through. The heddles, the small frames that controlled the warp threads, were tangled and missing several of the wire loops that should have lined them. The treadles worked, barely, with a grinding resistance that meant something in the mechanism beneath the seat was seized or misaligned. And the reed, the comb-like piece that beat the weft into place, had 3 broken dents in the center section. These were specific problems. Every one of them had a specific solution. That was what she had seen in Flett's shed, standing in the cold with her hands in her pockets, while he waited for her to admit that it wasn't worth it. She did not admit that. She got out her father's toolbox, which she kept under the bed because it was the thing she was least willing to lose, and she opened it on the floor beside the loom and began. The first week was diagnosis, mostly. She didn't try to fix anything that first week. She took the loom apart in sections, laid the pieces on the floor in order, examined each one in the afternoon light, and wrote down what she found in the notebook she kept for household accounts. The notebook had columns for expenses and income, and a running tally of what was owed to the feed merchant in town. She added a new section in the back pages, and filled it with observations about the loom that she would not have been able to explain clearly to anyone who asked. The heddle loops, for instance. They were not simply missing. Some of them had been replaced with the wrong gauge of wire, which had bent and pulled the others out of alignment over time. One problem feeding into another, invisibly, until the whole system looked like it had failed all at once, when really it had failed slowly over years, for a single correctable reason. She wrote that down. She wrote everything down. The neighbors knew about the loom before the end of that first week. Dunvegan Crossing was a settlement of perhaps 300 people spread across 12 miles of the Peace River country, and information moved through it with the unhurried certainty of water finding the lowest ground. By Thursday, Mabel Rostock at the dry goods store had heard that Cora Beaumont had traded her dead husband's horse for a loom that didn't work. By Saturday, the version that reached the Delacroix family at the south end of the valley included the detail, invented somewhere along the way, that she had paid cash money for it, which was worse. She became aware of this on her next trip into town for supplies, when the quality of the silence in Rosk's store told her everything she needed to know about what had been said before she arrived. She bought her flour and her salt, and the specific gauge of wire she needed for the heddle repairs. And she said good morning to the two women near the fabric bolts, who were clearly waiting to see what she would do, and she left. On the steps she passed Edna Voss, who had been in Dunvegan Crossing longer than anyone else still living, and who had earned the right to say things directly by having seen most of what there was to see. "I heard about the loom," Edna said. "Most people have." That was Solange Okafor's machine. She brought it from Quebec when she came west, kept it 20 years, gave it up 2 years ago when it stopped running. "I know." Solange Okafor was an excellent weaver. "I know that too." Edna looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has decided something, but hasn't decided yet whether to say it. "What makes you think you can do what she couldn't?" Cora considered the question honestly. "I don't know that I can," she said. "I know what's wrong with it. Whether I can fix what's wrong with it is a different question. Those aren't usually different questions." "They are to me," Cora said. "I've been wrong about the first part before, never about the second." She walked to the cart and drove home. The heddle repairs took 11 days. Not because they were complex. They weren't, once she understood the gauge problem, but because the wire she'd bought needed to be cut and formed by hand and threaded through the existing heddle frames without disturbing the warp ties that were still intact. She worked in the afternoons, when the light was best, and in the early mornings before it got cold enough to make her fingers clumsy. She kept the notebook open on the seat beside her and added to it each session. What she'd done, what she'd observed, what she intended to try next. The beater crack she addressed with a piece of hardwood from the scrap pile behind the barn, shaped and fitted and held with hide glue that she made herself from a recipe her mother had used for furniture repairs. It wasn't invisible, the repair. Anyone who looked carefully could see the seam, but it was solid, and solid was what mattered. The mechanism beneath the seat took her the longest. She had to remove the treadle assembly entirely and lay it on the kitchen floor to find the problem, which turned out to be a single wooden pin that had swollen in the socket, probably years ago in a wet season, and had been slowly torquing the entire treadle linkage out of true ever since. She replaced the pin with a piece of dried birch. She retrued the linkage by hand. She tested the treadles 12 times before she was satisfied. The broken reed dents she could not fix. She ordered a replacement reed from a supplier in Edmonton through Rostock's store, which cost her $9 and took 3 weeks to arrive, and which Mabel Rostock told her about, with an expression that was trying not to be sympathetic and almost succeeding. $9 is a lot for a loom that might not run anyway, Mabel said. "It'll run," Cora said. "How do you know?" "Because I know what was wrong with it, and I've fixed what was wrong with it." She paid for the order and the rest of her supplies. "The reed is the last piece." Mabel looked at her for a moment, in the way of a person reassessing something. "Thomas always said you were the practical one." "Thomas was right about most things," Cora said, and left before Mabel could add anything to that. The reed arrived on a Wednesday in late May. She fitted it that afternoon, seated herself at the loom for the first time, and ran a plain weave test with the wool she'd been saving. A skein of undyed gray that she'd bought before Thomas died and never used. Her hands knew the motion, which surprised her. She had learned to weave from her grandmother in Ontario and had not done it in 6 years, and yet the sequence of movements returned to her, as if she had simply set it down and picked it back up. The same task continued. The cloth she produced from that first test was rough and uneven. She expected that. What she did not expect was the particular quality of the evenness it achieved in the final few inches, once her hands had found the rhythm again. She held the fabric up to the window light and looked at it for a long time. Then she wrote in the notebook, "First test. Reed fitted correctly. Beater tracking true. Treadle response consistent. Tension uneven in warp. Adjust tie-up before next session. Weave quality improving in final pass. Machine is functional." She sat with that last line for a moment. Then she added, "It was never the loom. It was the accumulated damage of small misalignments no one stopped to identify." She closed the notebook and went to make tea. Word that the loom was running reached Dunvegan Crossing before the end of the week, which was faster than she'd expected but not surprising. She had asked her nearest neighbor, Frida Kuntz, to return a borrowed pot that same afternoon, and Frida had eyes that missed nothing and a social network that made the telegraph look sluggish. The response was not what she'd anticipated. She had expected skepticism, maybe another version of the silence she'd received in Rostock's store. What she got instead was something more complicated. The first person to come to her door was not a skeptic. It was a woman named Philippa Crane, who had the claim 2 miles east, and who arrived on a Saturday morning with a basket over her arm and the look of someone who had decided to say something and was going to say it regardless of how it landed. "I've got 12 pounds of fleece I've been trying to find someone to weave for 3 seasons, Philippa said. "Mrs. Okafor used to do it. I heard your loom is running." Cora looked at her. "It's running. I'm not set up for contract work yet. What would set up look like? Another month, maybe 6 weeks. I need to work through my own backlog first and make sure the machine is consistent before I take on someone else's fiber." Philippa set the basket down on the porch step and opened the lid. The fleece inside was clean and prepared, lanolin still in it, the warm smell of sheep rising in the morning air. She had washed it, Cora could see, but not processed it further. It would need to be carded before it could be spun, and spun before it could be woven. Philippa had done none of that. She had brought raw fleece to someone she assumed would know what to do with it. "Come back in 6 weeks, Cora said, "and bring it already carded, if you have a way to do that." "If I had a way to do that, I wouldn't need you," Philippa said. But she picked up the basket without argument and walked back to her horse. Cora stood in the doorway and watched her go and thought about what 6 weeks looked like in practical terms. She had the loom. She had her own wool from the 2 sheep she'd kept through the winter. She had the notebook and what she'd been learning about the loom's particular characteristics since she'd started running it. Which threads it handled most consistently, which weights produced the most even cloth, how the tension needed to be adjusted as the humidity shifted with the late spring weather. She went back inside and opened the notebook to a fresh page. The 6 weeks were harder than she'd planned, because learning a machine is different from fixing one. She had understood how to repair the loom before she ran it. Understanding how to run it required a different kind of attention, slower and more iterative, the kind that comes from producing cloth that isn't right yet and looking at it carefully to understand why. She filled 4 pages of the notebook in that 6 weeks, not with theory, with specific observations about specific results from specific decisions, written down in the same columns she used for the household accounts, because that was the kind of mind she had, the kind that needed things organized in a form it could compare. She produced 3 pieces of cloth in that time. The first was rough. The second was better, consistent in the body of it, but loose at the edges in a way that told her something about how she was managing the selvage. The third was something she looked at in the window light and couldn't immediately find fault with. She folded it and put it on the shelf and did not show it to anyone. But she wrote about it in the notebook, all 3 pieces, every adjustment she'd made between them and what she'd observed in the result. If it worked, she wanted to know exactly what had worked. That was the only way to do it again. The second person who came to the door was Edna Voss, which surprised her. Edna did not generally come to people's doors. People came to hers. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the first week of June, on foot, which meant she'd walked the half-mile from the road because she'd decided to come, and walking was simpler than hitching a horse. She looked at the loom without saying anything for a long moment. "May I?" she said, meaning the bench. "Go ahead." Edna sat down and put her hands on the beater rail and moved it once, forward and back. Then she looked at the cloth Cora had on the frame, which was a plain twill she was experimenting with, undyed wool in 2 weights. "You fixed the beater crack yourself," Edna said. "It wasn't a question. Hide glue and hardwood, your mother's method." Cora looked at her. "You knew my mother? I knew your grandmother. She fixed a chair the same way, a long time ago. I recognized the seam." Edna let go of the beater and looked around the room, at the notebook open on the stool, at the organized scraps of wire and thread on the small table, at the row of sample lengths Cora had pinned to the wall to compare. "You're keeping records, every session. Why?" It was the same question Philippa rather, had almost asked in a different form. Cora gave the same answer she had given herself. "Because if I know exactly what I did, I can do it again. And if something goes wrong, I can find where it went wrong, instead of starting over from nothing." Edna looked at the wall of samples. "Solange Okafor kept everything in her head," she said. She'd been weaving for 30 years. She knew that loom the way you know a voice, without having to think about it. And then she couldn't fix it when something went wrong, Cora said. A silence. No, Edna said. She couldn't. She knew it was broken, but she couldn't separate out which part of normal had gone wrong, because she'd never written down what normal was. She looked at Cora steadily. That's a precise way of putting it. It's a precise problem. Edna sat on the bench for another minute without speaking. Outside, the June evening was doing what June evenings did in the Peace River country, the light going long and gold across the fields, the kind of light that made everything look like it had just been decided to exist. Through the window, Cora could see the gray sheep in the paddock, the two she'd kept through the winter, moving in the loose wandering way of animals, with nothing currently requiring their attention. I have a daughter, Edna said finally, who has been trying to establish herself as a dressmaker in Grande Prairie for 2 years. She's skilled. She's better than skilled. The problem is fabric. What comes through the dry goods stores is inconsistent and expensive, and she can't build a reputation on inconsistent, expensive fabric. Cora looked at her. I'm not asking you for anything specific, Edna said. I'm telling you what I know, because I think it's relevant. It's relevant, Cora said. Edna stood. She straightened her coat in the precise way she did everything. What you're doing here, she said, is not something I would have predicted when you bought that loom from Angus Flett. I thought it was the decision of a woman who was still in grief and not thinking clearly. I was in grief, Cora said. I'm still in grief. Those things don't cancel each other. No, Edna said. I can see that now. She moved toward the door. My daughter's name is Harriet. If you get to a point where you have cloth to offer, I'd like you to speak to her before you speak to anyone else. I'll do that, Cora said. Edna left the way she'd arrived, on foot, with the self-sufficient directness of someone who had decided what she wanted to know and had come to find it out. Cora stood in the doorway and watched her go, and then turned back to the loom and the light and the notebook. She wrote, E. Voss, daughter in Grande Prairie, dressmaking. Fabric supply problem, possible future arrangement. First outside inquiry from someone I respect. She underlined those last 5 words and looked at them for a moment. Then she went back to the twill. The trouble arrived in July, carried by the same person who had carried most of the interesting information through Dunvegan Crossing for as long as Cora had lived there. Mabel Rostock's eldest son, Gareth, who was 17, and whose primary occupation appeared to be knowing things before anyone else did. He came by on a weekday morning while Cora was in the paddock checking on the sheep, and he delivered his information with the efficiency of someone who has a lot of ground to cover. There's a man been asking about you, he said. In the store. He's from the south, he said. Something to do with textiles. What kind of something? He didn't say exactly. He bought a sack of flour and asked my mother if she knew a woman in the valley who was running a loom. She told him about you. Cora looked at him. When was this? Yesterday afternoon. He's staying at Pickett's boarding house. Mother thought you should know. She thanked him, and he left with the speed of someone with more stops to make. She went back inside and stood at the window, looking at nothing in particular, and then she opened the notebook and began making notes about the man from the south, the way she made notes about anything that arrived unexpectedly and needed to be understood before she reacted to it. What she knew, what she didn't know, what she was and was not willing to do, depending on what he turned out to want. Edna Voss came by that same afternoon, which suggested that Edna had her own sources at Rostock's and had made the same calculation about relevance. You've heard, Cora said. I've heard there's a man from Lethbridge who works for something called the Western Craft Producers Exchange. They buy directly from producers and distribute through retail accounts in Calgary and Edmonton. Edna sat down without being asked, which was her way. They've been doing this for about 4 years. They have a reasonable reputation for paying fairly. How do you know about them? My daughter knows about them. She's bought fabric through one of their Calgary accounts. Edna paused. The fabric was inconsistent because the producers they're buying from are inconsistent. That would be my inference. Cora looked at the notebook. What does he want here? My guess is that someone told someone who told someone that there's a woman in the Peace River country producing unusually consistent cloth from a reclaimed loom. Those things travel. In the textile trade, I haven't sold anything yet. You've shown cloth to Philippa Crane and 2 other women I can think of. Philippa talks. Cora thought about this. She thought about the notebook and what it contained, and what it would mean to someone from the South who dealt in fabric. "Let him come," she said, "but I want to understand what he's actually offering before I decide anything." The man's name was Douglas Farr. He arrived the following morning in a truck that had been on worse roads than hers and showed it. And he got out with the unhurried movement of someone who had been traveling for days and had stopped expecting comfort from the journey. He was perhaps 50, gray at the temples, with the kind of practical face that comes from spending a career evaluating things quickly and accurately. He looked at the property before he looked at her, which she noted. He looked at it carefully, with the particular attention of someone reading information rather than forming an impression. She met him at the gate. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said. He had a straightforward handshake. "I appreciate you seeing me." "I haven't agreed to anything yet," she said. "Come in." She put him at the kitchen table and made tea, real tea, which she'd been rationing, because this felt like the kind of occasion that warranted it, and she sat across from him without offering anything else. She wanted him slightly off balance. Not uncomfortable, but aware that hospitality here was conditional on the conversation. He seemed to understand this, which adjusted her first impression of him upward. "I'll tell you why I'm here without making you drag it out of me," he said. He put a leather satchel on the table, but didn't open it. The Western Craft Producers Exchange works with approximately 40 producers across Alberta and BC. We broker their goods to retail accounts in the cities and take a percentage. Our main problem is quality consistency. We can find people who produce good cloth. We can't find people who produce consistently good cloth, session after session, year after year, in a way that retail accounts can depend on. How did you hear about me? Philippa Crane's sister-in-law is married to a man who buys wool from a distributor I know in Edmonton. The distributor mentioned that someone in the Peace River country had reclaimed a loom that had been given up on and was producing cloth that didn't match what he'd expect from that situation. He paused. "I've followed up on 6 similar reports in 3 years. 4 of them turned out to be ordinary production. 1 was genuine, but the producer had no documentation and couldn't explain her method. 1 I'm still investigating. What does documentation have to do with it? If you can't explain your method, you can't reproduce it when something changes. A new batch of fiber, a different season, a small change in the loom. Producers who work by feel produce good cloth until they produce bad cloth, and they can't tell me why the change happened." He looked at her steadily. "A producer who can tell me why can fix it." Cora put her hand on the notebook, which was on the table beside the tea. She did not open it. "What does the exchange offer?" she said. "A purchase arrangement. We buy at a fixed rate per yard, with a quality premium for production that meets our consistency standard. We handle distribution, we handle the retail relationships, and we take 30% of sale price." 30%. That's our standard arrangement. "Your standard arrangement is with producers who can't explain their method," Cora said. "Open it," she said, and slid the notebook across the table. He looked at her. "May I?" She didn't answer. He opened it. He read without speaking. She watched his face, which gave very little away, but she had learned to read the small shifts in a person's attention the moment the eyes move differently, slower, because the mind is fully engaged rather than evaluating. That shift happened within the first page. He turned to the sample records in the back section, then to the repair notes she'd kept in the earliest pages, then forward again. He looked up. "You documented the diagnostic process," he said, "before the repairs. If I didn't understand what was wrong, I couldn't know whether I'd fixed it. And you've been recording production outcomes since you started running it, every session. What I did and what resulted and what I changed and why." He turned to the most recent pages, the comparisons she'd been making between fiber weights and weave structures, the notes on selvage management, the small adjustments she'd made to tie up based on what she'd observed in the finished cloth. He read those for a longer time. "This is not what I expected to find," he said. "What did you expect?" "Honestly, I expected a skilled woman who'd gotten a useful piece of equipment running and had a good instinct for cloth. That's the usual situation." He closed the notebook carefully and set it back in front of her. "This is something different. You've been building a method, not just producing cloth, building an understanding of why the cloth comes out the way it does. Because if I don't know why it works, I can't make it work again." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the wall where she'd pinned the sample lengths. She'd moved them from the main room to the kitchen when the collection had outgrown the space. 3 months of production, each piece labeled in pencil, with the date and the fiber and the weave structure and the notes from the session it came from. "May I look at those?" he said. She stood and walked him along the wall without speaking. He touched the fabric as he went, the careful touch of someone who has been evaluating cloth long enough that his hands know things before his mind has articulated them. At the third piece, the plain twill she'd produced in the early sessions, the inconsistent one, he paused. "This is early production, first month." He moved to the end of the row, to the most recent pieces. His hand stilled on the last one, a fine wool tabby she'd finished 4 days ago, undyed, the natural brown-gray of the sheep's fleece. "This is different," he said. "It's the same loom and the same fiber. The consistency is different." "Yes." He stepped back and looked at the full row. Then he looked at her. 30% is our standard rate," he said. "But our standard producers aren't producing this. And they don't have documentation." He paused. "What do you want?" The directness of the question caught her slightly off balance. She had come into this conversation prepared for negotiation, for the back and forth of two people feeling out the distance between their positions. He had simply asked. "I want a fair rate," she said. "That reflects the fact that consistency is exactly what you can't find, and I can provide it. 30% doesn't reflect that. What does reflect it? 20%. With a written quality standard, defined in advance, so that we both know exactly what I'm producing toward, and you know exactly what you're paying the premium for." He looked at the notebook. "And if I scale up, more looms, more production, the rate holds," she added. "You're thinking about scaling. I'm thinking about what I've learned about this loom and whether it transfers to other equipment. I believe it does." She paused. "I also have at least one arrangement already forming with a dressmaker in Grande Prairie, separate from anything we do. That stays separate." He was quiet. He picked up the notebook from the table and opened it again. Not to read, he'd read it, but to look at it as an object, the physical record of what it represented. 20% and a written standard, he said. "I'd need to get confirmation from our board, but I'm authorized to make a preliminary agreement if the terms are workable. Those terms are workable." She put her hand across the table. He shook it. They spent the next hour going through the sample lengths together, Farr asking questions about specific pieces, and Cora answering them with the precision that comes from having written everything down within an hour of doing it. He was a good questioner, specific, technical, genuinely curious in a way that wasn't performance. At one point he stopped at the rough first piece, the one she'd almost not kept, and held it up to the light. "You kept this," he said. "It shows where I started. Most producers throw out the failures." "I don't think of it as a failure," she said. "I think of it as the first data point." He put it back carefully, the way she'd put it up, and moved on. Before he left, she took him into the main room and let him see the loom. He stood in front of it for a moment without speaking, looking at the repaired beater rail, the new reed, the careful geometry of the heddle arrangement. "You fixed all of this yourself," he said. "I figured out what was wrong with it. That was the harder part. What was wrong with it? Small misalignments. One problem feeding into another over years, until the whole machine looked like it had failed, when really it had failed for a single small reason that nobody stopped to identify." He looked at the loom for another moment. "The woman who owned it before you," he said. "What happened to her?" "She gave up on it," Cora said. "She was an excellent weaver. She just didn't write anything down." He nodded slowly, in the way of a man adding a piece of information to something he already half understood. He left with a list of the sample lengths and their specifications, not the notebook itself, which stayed on the table in the kitchen. She walked him to the truck, and he climbed in with the efficiency of someone accustomed to covering ground quickly and getting back to it. 2 weeks, he said. "The board meets the second Friday of the month." "I'll send word. I'll be here," she said. She stood at the gate until the truck was gone, then stood there a moment longer in the July afternoon, which was warm and still in the way of the best days of the short northern summer. The 2 sheep were in the paddock. The loom was in the house. The notebook was on the kitchen table. Everything she had built was exactly where she'd put it, unchanged by the hour just past, and she was aware of how thin the margin had been between this conversation and a different one. Different cloth on the wall. Different answers to his questions. No notebook. Any of those things, and the conversation would have ended differently. She went back inside. Edna Voss was there on the same evening, sitting in the kitchen with a proprietary air that suggested she had knocked and found the door unlocked and made her own decision about entering. She had brought a jar of something from her garden, preserved Saskatoons Cora saw, the dark sweet ones that came ripe in July. "Well," Edna said. 20%, Cora said. "Written standard. Preliminary agreement pending board confirmation." Edna was quiet for a moment. "And Harriet? That stays separate. I told him that explicitly." Edna picked up her tea. She had made her own tea, which Cora noted without comment. "You went in there, intending to hold that line. I wrote out what I was and wasn't willing to do before he arrived. It made the conversation simpler. What made you think to do that?" Cora looked at the notebook. "The same thing that made me keep records of the loom. If you don't decide in advance what matters, you decide in the moment, and in the moment you're managing too many things at once to decide clearly." Edna held her cup and looked at the sample lengths on the wall. "Thomas said you were the practical one," she said. "He told me that, actually, the winter before he died." "When did you talk to Thomas about me?" "A few times. He was a man who thought carefully about his life and occasionally needed someone to think out loud with." She set her cup down. "He said you approached problems differently from anyone he'd ever known, that you went toward the hard things instead of around them." Cora looked at the window. The evening light was the long gold of July, the kind that lasted until 10, and made the dark when it finally came feel like a decision rather than a fact. "I bought that loom because everyone had decided it was finished," she said. "That's the honest reason. Not because I was certain I could fix it. Because everyone had decided it couldn't be fixed without really looking at it, and I have never been able to walk past that without needing to look myself. And when you looked, I saw specific problems with specific solutions. I didn't know whether I could execute the solutions. I knew there were solutions to find." She picked up the notebook and held it. "The looking is the thing. Most of what gets given up on isn't past saving. It's just past the patience of the person who gave up on it." Edna was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the sheep moved in the paddock, a slow, soft sound of hooves on grass. "Harriet is coming in August," she said finally. She'd planned to come for a week regardless. "I'd like you to meet her while she's here." "I'd like that." Edna stood and pulled her coat straight in the decisive way she did everything. "What you've built here, Cora, in 8 months from nothing, without help." She paused, and for a moment her face opened into something that was not quite warmth, because warmth was not Edna Voss's register, but was something close to it. The expression of a woman who has reassessed something and is choosing to say so directly. "I told 3 people that buying that loom was grief doing the thinking for you. I want you to know that. I know you did. I was wrong, yes," Cora said. "You were." And because it was Edna, she said it plainly, without softening. Edna nodded once. She picked up the jar of Saskatoons from the table and handed it across. "Put those up somewhere they won't be wasted." She left, and Cora set the jar on the shelf above the stove, next to the small tin of tea she was rationing, and stood there for a moment, looking at the shelf. Then she opened the notebook and wrote the date, and added, "E. Voss." Acknowledged the error in her initial assessment without being asked. Said 3 people heard the same opinion from her. This is the kind of record that doesn't belong in the production notes but matters for what comes next. She closed the notebook and went to check the loom. The board confirmation came 10 days later, not 2 weeks, which she took as a good sign about how the meeting had gone. The letter was factual and specific, which she appreciated. Confirmed rate of 20%. Quality standard to be agreed in writing before first purchase shipment. Preliminary interest in scaling arrangements as production increased. There was a handwritten note at the bottom from FAR. The sample lengths were presented to the board. The documentation was described, correctly, as the most complete production record we have seen from any producer we work with. This influenced the board's decision. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then folded it and put it under the notebook and went to find her neighbor's boy, who ran messages into Dunvegan Crossing for a small fee and sent word to Edna Voss. The August that followed was the busiest she had known. The agreement with the exchange required a formal production schedule and a first shipment, which meant running the loom every day and refining her process against the written standard she and FAR agreed on over 2 letters. Harriet Voss arrived as planned. And Cora spent an afternoon with her that extended into an evening. And then dinner, the two of them at the kitchen table, with the notebook open, and the sample lengths spread around them like a map of where the work had been. Harriet was 26, direct in the way of her mother, with the specific practical intelligence of someone who had built a skill through years of independent effort. She looked at the cloth the way Douglas Farr had looked at it, with hands that knew what they were reading. "This is the consistency problem solved," Harriet said, holding the fine tabby to the window. "This is what I've been paying Calgary prices for and not getting. What do you need for the dressmaking work?" Harriet told her. The conversation took the rest of the evening, working through weights and widths and fiber content and the particular requirements of garment construction that Cora hadn't needed to think about when weaving for general use. She added 3 pages to the notebook that night, with Harriet's specifications written in the same columns as the production records, because they belonged in the same place. They were part of the same body of knowledge. Before Harriet left, she said, "My mother told me you traded your father's horse for this loom." "My husband's horse," Cora said. "Yes." Harriet looked at the loom across the room, running in the long afternoon light. She said, "Everyone thought you'd lost your mind. Most people. Had you?" Cora considered this honestly. "I was still in the early part of grief," she said. "But grief wasn't why I bought it. I bought it because I saw something in it that everyone else had decided wasn't there." "And was it?" Cora looked at the sample lengths on the wall, the rough early cloth and the consistent later cloth and everything between. She looked at the notebook on the table, 2/3 full now, and already requiring a second one. She looked at the letter from the exchange under the notebook's cover. "It was," she said. "And a little more than that, actually, which is what I find tends to happen when you look at something carefully that everyone else has given up looking at." Harriet left in the late afternoon, and Cora stood on the porch for a moment in the August warmth, which was the good warm of a season that knew it was ending and was making the most of what time it had left. The sheep were in the far paddock. The loom was in the house. The notebook was on the table. She went inside and sat down and opened the notebook to a fresh page. The autumn arrived with the particular businesslike quality of autumn in the Peace River country, which did not negotiate or linger. It came when it decided to come and proceeded on its own schedule. Cora had the new wool from shearing, which she had arranged to supplement with fiber from 2 other small flocks nearby. An arrangement that had come about through Philippa Crane, who had arrived in late September with her 12 pounds of fleece finally carded and the somewhat grudging acknowledgement that she'd followed the preparation instruction correctly. The fleece was good. Cora told her so, and Philippa's expression shifted in the way expressions shift when a person has been expecting criticism and received something else. "You're taking it then," Philippa said. "I'm taking it. Come back in 6 weeks. What will you make with it? What do you need?" Philippa told her. Cora wrote it down. This was how it worked now, the particular rhythm of production and request, and the record that kept everything in its place. She ran the loom in the mornings when the light was right, and spent the afternoons on the writing and the correspondence and the small accounting that had grown with the exchange arrangement into something that actually balanced. Money coming in, consistent and specific, something she had not had since before Thomas died. She thought about that sometimes, in the evenings, sitting at the table after the day's work was finished. Not with sentiment, exactly, with a kind of clear-eyed accounting of where things had been and where they were. The horse she'd traded for the loom, the $40 in her pocket on that Tuesday morning in April, the silence in Rostock's store, Edna Voss on the porch telling her that the loom was beyond saving. Those things were true, and they had all led here, and she did not think of them as suffering she had overcome, because that was not the honest way to say it. She thought of them as the specific conditions of a specific situation that had required a specific response. She had looked at the loom. She had seen what was wrong with it. She had fixed what was wrong with it. The rest had followed from that. She was not the same person who had driven the loom home in a borrowed cart in April. She knew that in the particular way you know things about yourself only after the event has revealed them. The way knowing yourself in a difficult situation is different from knowing yourself in an easy one. She had not known she could sustain this level of attention. She had not known she could hold her position in that conversation with Farr, with the notebook in front of her and the cloth on the wall, She had not known that she could write her method down in a form that another person could read and learn from. She knew all of that now. On a Thursday evening in October, the first real cold of the season coming in off the northwest, she was at the Loom with the lamp lit against the early dark when she heard the knock at the door. It was Edna Voss, which was becoming a Thursday evening pattern that neither of them had named. Edna came in and sat down in the chair by the window and looked at the cloth on the loom, which was the first piece from Philippa's fleece, a medium-weight twill in the natural gray of the fiber. "Harriet telephoned," she said. "She has her first retail account in Grande Prairie, who's asking specifically for fabric from a Peace River producer, by name." Cora kept weaving. "By your name," Edna said. She stopped. She looked at the cloth on the frame. "She wanted me to ask if you had capacity for a regular arrangement," Edna said. "Monthly. Whatever you can consistently produce, she'll take." Cora looked at the notebook on the stool beside her. She looked at the lamp on the table, the circle of light it made in the October dark. She thought about capacity and what it meant in practical terms, and she thought about a second loom in the second room, and she thought about what she knew now about looms and their particular failures that she had not known in April. "Tell Harriet yes," she said, "and tell her to give me until spring to work out what consistent production looks like at that volume. She'll want a number. I'll have a number by November. Tell her to call again in 3 weeks." Edna nodded. She did not move to leave, which meant she had something else. "What?" Cora said. "Mabel Rostock." Edna said, "Told me this morning that she wished she'd thought to buy that loom herself." Cora looked at her. "I thought you'd want to know," Edna said, in the neutral tone she used when something was not neutral. Cora thought about the silence in Rostock's store in April, the expression on Mabel's face when she'd ordered the $9 reed, the careful sympathy she hadn't quite expressed. "Mabel Rostock didn't buy that loom," Cora said, "because Mabel Rostock looked at it and decided it was finished." "Yes," Edna said. "There's nothing else to say about it." "No," Edna agreed. "There isn't." She stayed another half hour in the way she stayed now, the two of them talking about the work and the winter ahead and the things that needed doing, and Cora kept the loom running while they talked because the light was still good enough, and the cloth didn't stop requiring attention just because there was company. When Edna left, Cora sat at the loom in the lamp circle for a while, longer, not weaving, just sitting with the machine that had cost her a horse and $40 in 8 months of the most concentrated attention she had ever applied to anything. The loom was quiet when it wasn't running. She had never noticed that in the early weeks, when she was too focused on the mechanics to notice anything else. But now she noticed the particular silence of a thing that was well-made and well-maintained and waiting, with the patient quality of something that had more time than the person operating it. She put her hand on the beater rail, the repaired one, the hardwood and hide glue repair. You could see if you looked for it, and held it there for a moment. Then she opened the notebook to the next empty page, wrote the date, and began the record of the day.